If I were to say the name James Rowe, you may not be familiar with him as an individual per se, but if I were to list some of his works, hymns such as Home of the Soul, Ring the Message Out, Redeemed, and Love Lifted Me, you'd probably be more familiar with him than you realize. He wrote a song after reading based on Ezekiel 33, verses 7 and 8. And I'll paraphrase that passage, but it essentially talks about where Ezekiel is told as the watchman, if he warns his audience and they fail to heed his warning and they perish, the blood is on their hands. But if he as a watchman fails to warn them and they perish, then the blood is on his hands. And from that passage, Mr. Rowe derived or penned the song, You Never Mentioned Him to Me. One of the verses in that song goes, When in a better land, before the bar we stand, how deeply our souls, or how deeply grieved our souls will be, if any lost one there should cry out in deep despair, You never mentioned him to me. Then the chorus goes, You never mentioned him to me. You helped me not the light to see. You met me day by day and knew I was astray, yet you never mentioned him to me. If you're not already in John chapter 4, I'd encourage you to open your Bibles to that passage. When I first heard that song when I was much younger than I am now, I remember the impact it had on me. This thought of standing on judgment and someone that I know looking at me with that look of disappointment. I appreciate the theme of this week's gospel meeting, the harvest, and the various qualities of it. And I'm very thankful for this topic. We look at John chapter 4 and verse 35. Notice what it says. Jesus says, Do not say that there are still 4 months, then comes the harvest. Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look at the fields, for they are already white for harvest. 3 things Jesus points out in this passage that we're going to look at this morning. And the first is that you and I have to shift our focus when it comes to evangelism. One of the themes that runs throughout the book of John is Jesus constantly teaching and encouraging his audience to shift their focus from the physical to the spiritual. For example, John chapter 2, you remember when he throws out the money changers and he tells the group, destroy this temple and in 3 days I'll raise it up. You remember their response? It took 40-something years to build that temple, and you say you're going to rebuild it in 3 days. See, Jesus was talking on a spiritual level. Their minds were on a physical level. John chapter 3, his conversation with Nicodemus. What's he tell him? Unless a man is born again. And what was Nicodemus' response? How can a man re-enter into his mother and be born again? See, spiritual, physical. John chapter 4, he told the woman at the well, if the water that I provide, if you drink it, you'll never thirst. What she say? Well, tell me where this water is so I don't have to drag this bucket to the well every day. Same thing with John chapter 5. John chapter 6, when he says, I'm the bread of life, he gives them the bread of life discourse, and he makes the comments about eating his flesh and drinking of his blood, talking about the Lord's Supper from a spiritual standpoint. And what did they think? What's this guy talking about actually eating his flesh? John chapter 8 is probably the greatest. When he makes the point, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Verse 32, you remember their response? We haven't been in bondage to anybody. We haven't been, he's talking about being enslaved to sin. They're talking about being enslaved to nations, which wasn't an accurate statement in and of itself. But then you go later to the end of that chapter, and he says, Abraham rejoiced to see his day. And you remember their response? You're not even 50 years old. How do you know? How could you even see Abraham? See, the whole book of John throughout is that concept of changing the focus from the physical to the spiritual. And I believe that's the context here in verse 35. when Jesus makes that statement, don't say unto me, there are still 4 months and then comes the harvest. Remember, his disciples had just come back from gathering food in town. Now, some will look at this statement and they'll say, well, this is a proverb that we don't have any other accounts of, so we don't necessarily know what it means. And I suppose that could be the case, but I think this actually ties back to the conversation they're having. Look at what Jesus says, or what they say, the disciples say, starting in verse 31. It says, in the meantime, his disciples urged him, saying, Rabbi, eat. Verse 32, but he said to them, I have food to eat which you do not know. Therefore the disciples said to one another, has anyone brought him anything to eat? Then Jesus said to him, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work. And then he goes into our statement in verse 35. I would suspect, and this is just my theory, but I would suspect that when they tell him to eat and he makes that statement that he's already eaten, a conversation but amongst the disciples was taking place. He says, I've already eaten. They're trying to figure out who gave him food. Again, Jesus is talking on a spiritual level. Their minds are down here on the physical level. If you take the setting, they're at Jacob's well, and if you were standing at Jacob's well, then you would overlook the field of Moreh, which is a very fertile portion of that part of the world. And I would suspect during this conversation where they're trying to figure out where Jesus received something to eat, one of his disciples, maybe one who was not as privy to how agriculture works like Matthew, would have maybe suggested maybe he went down to the field of Moreh and grabbed some grain from that crop, and that's what he ate. To which one of the disciples responded, there's still 4 months before that grain is ready to eat. And at that point, Jesus, frustrated that they're not picking up what he's saying, goes into this discourse right here. Change your view from the physical to the spiritual. When it comes to evangelism, what inhibits an individual from evangelizing? What keeps members of God's church from spreading the gospel to their friends and their neighbors and their families and coworkers? Typically, it's physical repercussions, isn't it? When we think about it from that standpoint, I don't want to evangelize because maybe I look at my limitations. I'm not a good speaker. I'm going to mess something up in the Bible study. I just can't do it. It's a physical limitation we put on ourselves. Maybe we just assume someone else is going to do it. Therefore, I don't need to. Again, looking at it from a physical standpoint. Maybe we'll look at it from the standpoint of that person doesn't care about the gospel, as if we can read their hearts. Again, we're looking at it from a physical standpoint rather than the way that we should. Or maybe we look at it from the standpoint of preserving a relationship. I don't want them to be angry with me. I don't want to make things awkward between us. Again, we're putting physical limitations on our evangelistic efforts. But what I would like us to do for just a moment is consider the things that we know. Matthew chapter 7, starting at verse 13. Jesus said, enter ye in at the strait gate. Why? Because wide is the gate and broad is the way that leadeth to destruction, and many there be which enter thereat. Because strait is the gate and narrow is the way that leadeth to life, and few there be that find it. See, one thing you and I do know as God's people is that there are two paths. One leads to life, which not many will find, and one leads to destruction, which most will find. You and I also know the words of Jesus in John 14 and verse 6. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. You and I know that there's only one way. And then we go over to John chapter 4 and we read about the pillars of, or the foundation of unity that you and I have. and we see the word one mentioned throughout. One body, one faith, one hope. You and I also know, 1 Peter 3 and verse 21, baptism doth also now save us. That baptism is an intricate and a part of our salvation. And you and I know the people with whom we come in contact with on a daily basis. Most of them are in a state where if the world ended today or they were to lose their lives, that they would be lost. If we saw somebody in danger, physical danger, we saw someone standing in the middle of the highway out here today, and we saw a car coming towards them knowing that they could lose their life if they get hit by that car, would we just simply stand there and do nothing? Or would we warn them, plead with them to get off the road? Why is the spiritual state of our friends and our family and coworkers any different? We're willing to protect someone or warn someone about physical danger. Shouldn't we be willing to warn them about the spiritual danger that they're in? We've got to shift our focus from the physical to the spiritual. But if we continue reading in verse 35, notice what he says. He says, do not say there are still 4 months, and then comes the harvest. Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look. One, we've got to shift our focus from the physical to the spiritual. Number two, you and I have to look for opportunities, seek opportunities. We go throughout John in particular, and we see that it's almost as if opportunities fall into the lap of Jesus. For example, John chapter 3, Nicodemus comes to Jesus by night. It's almost like that opportunity to teach the religious leader, the Pharisee, fell into his lap. Here we go to John chapter 6, after Peter walked on the water and he saved him, and they went the next day. What happened? The crowd followed them and was seeking them the next day. Here in John chapter 4, after verse 35, Jesus looks up and you see a group of Samaritans coming out to hear his teaching. It would almost seem as if here come the opportunities. But rather than look at it from the standpoint or the perspective that these opportunities fell into the lap of Jesus, let's take a deeper look, because when we go back to John chapter 3, you remember in verse 2 what Nicodemus said, Rabbi, we know that thou art a teacher come from God, for no man can do the miracles that thou doest except God be with him. In other words, Jesus created that opportunity and was reaping the benefits when Nicodemus came to him. Same thing in John chapter 6. He fed them and he taught them, and that is what led them to come after him later in the chapter. And here in John chapter 4, the reason you have a group of Samaritans coming out to hear the things that he taught was because earlier in John chapter 4, he struck up a conversation with a Samaritan woman at the well. A conversation that culture told him he shouldn't have had because he was a Jew and because he was a man, yet he put aside the cultural differences and struck up this conversation with this woman. Jesus created opportunities, and as a result, those opportunities came to him. There's a misconception sometimes that the opportunities are supposed to come to us before we act. The Bible would actually make the opposite point. Matthew 28, go ye therefore and make disciples of every nation. Or Mark 16, verse 15, go ye into all the world and preach the gospel unto every creature. Both those instances of the Great Commission don't have a passive verb in them. They're active. Go and take the gospel to the world. Go to Acts chapter 8 when Paul starts to persecute the church at Saul of Tarsus. As we read in our Bibles, what happened? They went into the world, to the uttermost parts of the world, and began. In other words, God spread them throughout the world. We've got to be active. As we talked about this afternoon, this morning, we want to grow. We don't want to swell. evangelism is not gimmicks. That's not to say we can't be creative in what we do, but we don't want to be gimmicky. Everything we do as a congregation, in my humble opinion, should point to two works of the church. If we wanted to boil the work of the church down to two categories, I think we could boil it down to two. One, the edification of the saints. In other words, helping one another grow in Christ. And the second is the evangelism of the lost. Anything that we do should be geared or pointed or have the end goal of completing one of those two tasks. I heard an individual one time make the comment that if I could bring my guitar, I think we'd get more people in the door. That's not what God prescribes. God wants us to grow. So how can you and I grow? How can you and I look for opportunities? Number one, we need to be different. Go back to verse 25 of John chapter 4 and look at the example Jesus gives us. The woman said to him, I know that the Messiah is coming, who is called the Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all these things. Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am he. You go down to verse 29. And what's it say? Come, this woman speaking to those in town, come see a man who told me all the things that I ever did. Could this be the Christ? Something in this conversation set Jesus apart from a typical individual. In fact, you remember when he first strikes up the conversation at the beginning of the chapter, what's her response? Why are you, a man and a Jew, talking to me? And then as the conversation progresses, he didn't take offense to it. He continues to talk to her. And then she perceives that maybe he's a prophet. And then as the conversation progresses, we eventually get to where we read, where she starts to think there's something more about this man. Perhaps this is the Messiah that the Old Testament speaks of. Jesus was different. You and I will never be able to evangelize anybody if we act and we think and we talk as the world does. Be holy, for I am holy, 1 Peter 1 and verse 16. Jesus' prayer in John 17, starting in verse 15. He said, I pray not that thou shouldest take them out of the world, but that thou shouldest keep them from the evil one. For they are not of the world, even as I am not of the world. Sanctify them through thy truth. Set them apart. Make them different through thy truth. Thy word is truth. You and I have to act differently from the world if we're going to attract the world. Number two, you and I have to lift up our eyes. With 2 teenagers, 3 children who are active in a lot of things, I understand. I'm talking to myself more so than anyone. But you and I can be so enthralled in the rat race that we tend to miss the opportunities that are putting themselves in front of us on a daily basis. There are things going on around us in our lives that are opportunities for us to evangelize the people who we are around. Now, I've never had anyone just randomly. Now, I've had people I know, but I've never had anyone randomly come up to me in a strange place and ask me to study the Bible. It's never happened. But I have had people approach me out of nowhere, and they've asked me for money. I've had friends and coworkers ask me to pray for them because of various things going on in their lives. I've had people ask me Bible questions out of nowhere. See, those are opportunities where we can put our foot in the door and begin to build on those things in order to create the evangelistic opportunities that we want, that we desire. We can also ask the question, how do I evangelize? I don't know if y'all have heard Rob Whitaker lately in his evangelism seminar, but one thing that I do appreciate about what he does is he makes the point that evangelism is more than just studying the Bible. That's a part of it. But I think sometimes we make the scope of evangelism too small. Evangelism can be a lot of things that we do. Living a life different in front of the world is a part of our evangelistic capability. Being able to provide an answer for someone to a Bible question is evangelistic opportunity. Being known as a person who prays is an evangelistic opportunity. We may not have a Bible study with someone, but there are things that we could be doing to evangelize. In fact, I remember talking to my dad one time about he taught when he was teaching at Southwest in Austin. He made the point that he was on his way home, and he essentially, with the director at the time, Rick Brumbeck, had to convince an individual to drop out of school, out of preaching school, because the stress he was putting on himself was so great that he was making himself sick. It was a health issue. And he was disappointed in it because he said this individual was one of the most evangelistic people he'd ever met. And I just made the comment, I think it's weird that you can study the Bible with someone, but then you would put stress, and he made the point, he goes, he had a difficult time leading a Bible study because of the same thing. He put so much pressure on himself not wanting to say the wrong thing or not wanting to say something that might hurt the person's view, that he would put himself in undue stress. He said, but he was one of the most evangelistic people that he's ever met, because this man had a unique talent for bringing people to a Bible study. Someone else usually would conduct the Bible study, but this man had a unique way of bringing people to the Bible study. That's an evangelistic effort. There are opportunities out there. I read an article that we're seeing statistically an uptick in religious interest among the younger portion of Generation Y all the way to the older portion of Generation Alpha, which would be anyone from the ages of about 12 years old up into the early 20s, maybe even to the early 30s. Friends, we live in a world where people want better. And you and I have the best that we could possibly give somebody. There are opportunities out there. Notice how he closes out verse 35. He said, behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look at the fields, for they are already white for harvest. Finally, you and I need to start looking at the spiritual rather than the physical. You and I need to start looking for opportunities. And like Jesus, you and I need to be optimistic. Jesus was very honest. And at times, Jesus was very direct. But Jesus was also very optimistic. John 14, he's essentially starting to prepare his apostles for his departure, his crucifixion. And you remember what he says, let not your heart be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. And then what's he do? In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there you may be also. He was optimistic. John 16 and verse 33, he tells them very honestly, in this world you will have tribulation. But then what does he say? Do not worry. Why? Because I've overcome the world. Go back to John in our chapter, and let's look at verse 21. I want you to notice something in his conversation with the woman at the well. She asked him to essentially answer a question that the Samaritan and Jews had been an argument they'd been having for centuries. Basically, where should we worship? In Jerusalem, or can we worship at Mount Gerizim? And so she asked him to settle it, and Jesus says to her, woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. Look at verse 22. You worship what you do not know. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. In other words, he told the woman at the well, you and your people and your view on this topic is wrong. But then look what he says in verse 23. But the hour is coming, and as now is, when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for the Father is seeking such to worship him. So he tells her she's wrong, but then he says, but wait, There'll be a time where it doesn't matter. Jerusalem, Mount Gerizim won't matter because God's looking for someone with the right attitude, worshiping in the right way, and it doesn't matter where you participate in the worship as long as you worship the way that you're supposed to. He closed it off with an optimistic view. He tells his apostles in verse 35, lift up your eyes and look. The field is ready for harvest. Some commentators will say the field being white unto harvest, when you look over the field of Morah, the barley would take on a white tint. And so perhaps he was using the whiteness of the field to draw this illustration. And while I suppose that could be the case, I would argue more than likely what was happening is you had a group of Samaritans who had listened to this woman in town making their way out to Christ. White was the color of clothing of the common man. Wool is naturally white. It was very expensive to dye it the various colors. You read about Lydia in the book of Acts. She was a provider or a manufacturer or distributor of purple, which we lead to the conclusion that she was probably well off because it was very expensive to sell purple. So more than likely what I would say the fields are white unto harvest is Jesus is pointing towards a group of Samaritans coming out to hear him teach. The opportunity, and he was optimistic about it. He didn't say that they only take the first 5 books of the Old Testament, known as the Pentateuch, written by Moses. I said 4 this morning, I meant 5. So he didn't say that they worship in the wrong place. He didn't make a point about their nationality as some Jews would have. He just simply said, look at this opportunity approaching, and he was optimistic about it. We need to shift our focus from the physical to the spiritual. We need to look for opportunities, and we need to be optimistic. I want to close out with this. You can call it historical fiction. Before I became a preacher, I worked in a defense contractor, and most of my coworkers were prior military. Traveled all over the world, and I love sitting at lunch or going on business trips with them and just hearing them talk about accounts. And this is based on one of those accounts. Excuse me. There was a bridge that had gone out. And what made it so dangerous was the way the road was constructed. When you came over a crest of a hill, right before you got to the bridge, there wasn't a lot of time to stop. But you couldn't see from a distance that the bridge was out because of that hill. And what happened was you have a truck driver, because he sits up higher in his tractor, was able to see the bridge more so than a car sitting lower on the ground. And he realized the bridge was out long before the average driver did. And as he was driving, he started to slow down, and a car was coming up on him. And so he rolls down his window and is doing this, and he's screaming, the bridge is out, the bridge is out, the bridge is out. But the man angrily whips past him, passes him, speeds off, gives him a dirty look. And as he comes over the crest of the hill, he's going too fast, and before he can stop, he plummets to his death. The truck driver, not seeing cars approaching from behind, doesn't want anyone to meet the same fate as the man who just passed him. So he doesn't know what to do other than run his tractor and trailer perpendicular to the road and make it impossible for anyone to pass. And as you can imagine, traffic built up behind him. People started having to turn around and take detours because he had blocked the roadway. I want you to put yourself in one of 3 seats. So we're going to put ourselves in 3 seats. The first is the seat of that individual who passed angrily. As he came over the crest of that hill, and as his car went over the bridge that wasn't there, and he began to plummet to his death, what would go through your mind at that moment? Are you still angry at the truck driver? Or do you have regret? I know if it was me, I would have wished I would have listened to the warning of the man that I just passed angrily. The second seat I want you to put yourself in is the person right there at that truck when it's running parallel to the road. And you get out to ask what happened, and he tells you the bridge is out, a man just plummeted to his death. What's your view of the truck driver in that situation? You hug him, you shake his hand, you maybe help communicate what's going on to the people behind you. The third seat, someone who is far enough back that you don't know what's going on, but close enough that you can see the truck driver perpendicular to the road. And if you're like me, you don't like being in the car, so you're angry, you hit your detour, and instead of being home in an hour, it's going to take you 3 hours to get home. And if you're like me, at that 1 hour mark, I'm grumbling to myself, I should be home right now, but some truck driver doesn't know how to drive until I get home. And I read on the news that the bridge is out, someone died, but a heroic truck driver blocked the road so no one else lost their life. What's your view of the truck driver then when your family is safe at home? Because in reality, when we think about it from an evangelistic standpoint, those are the only three options that we have when we evangelize. Somebody's going to be angry at us initially, but there'll be a day when they regret how they responded to our evangelistic efforts. Someone may receive it without any inhibition, without any the so-called easy ones, or someone may later on down the road accept the gospel, look back when they got angry, and realize what you were trying to do. Now I want you to change that scenario up just a bit. Rather than running his truck parallel to the street, not wanting to be bothered, that truck driver turns around and starts heading the opposite direction, knowing that every car he passes could eventually drive off the edge of that bridge. You and I are on the straight gate, and we know the condition of those who are around us. Shouldn't we evangelize to them? From a spiritual standpoint, are we the ones who will run our truck perpendicular to save someone's soul? Or are we the ones who just drive not to be bothered, knowing where the wide road leads? If you have any need this afternoon, whether it's to obey the gospel by believing the words of Jesus, repenting, confessing, and entering the waters of baptism, or if there are those here who have strayed and want to return, I encourage you to come.